please join me, rather than long introductions, in welcoming some tremendous people to this stage. First off, I do want to say one thing. Congressman Robert Wexler, member of the House Judiciary Committee, who took the issue of impeachment and put it on the table. We are honored to have you with us today. Please grab a seat and we will. Congressman Keith Ellison. Who taught the Congress and a lot of people at Fox News that you can say your oath of allegiance on a Bible, a Torah, or a Quran. And who has been right there with Bob Wexler on these fundamental presidential accountability issues, impeachment, justice, and the war, Congressman Keith Ellison. And not to put any pressure on you, but this is the guy who signs my checks. Victor Navasky, who opened up the history of the Red Scare with his book, Naming Names, who has been a central figure in progressive and positive politics for generations. Editor, publisher, everything of The Nation magazine, one of the great historians and intellectuals of our time, Victor Navasky. Take a seat right there. Just sit right with these guys. All right. Now, here's the deal. When you let the Reverend Jesse Jackson take a moment to greet folks, it tightens your schedule. And some folks going to be moving faster, some slower here. I wanna focus in on Congressman Wexler for a moment because I know that he's got our tightest schedule. No disrespect, because I know everybody wants you too, Congressman. And I always want to take care of Victor. But Congressman Wexler, our issue today, the Constitution. You're a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and there's been a great deal of frustration with the committee on the part of some folks. There was a great deal of excitement when you made that leap to say the I word. Tell us about what took you, because you weren't preaching impeachment after they stole Florida, and you weren't preaching impeachment casually or early on. What made you take that step and do it and then write a terrific book which everybody has to buy about it?
Well, thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the question because I think it's an illustration of the effectiveness of groups like we have here today, the Progressive Democrats of America. I want to acknowledge and really pay an enormous amount of respect to The Nation magazine, which is the leading, I think, thought-provoking, patriotic magazine in America. Right. Let me answer the question. My district was the epicenter of the calamity in the election 2000. And my response to the election of 2000, the legislative response, was to engage in a campaign throughout Florida, but also in the country, to change the way in which we vote in this country and to make certain that every American, whether they be a Republican, a Democrat, a liberal or conservative, or anything in between, that when he or she votes, they vote on a voter-verifiable paper trail. And the good news is that in my home state of Florida, we've accomplished that. And this week we had primary voting and every Floridian voted for the first time on a voter verifiable paper trail, and we'll do the same in November. The problem is, in some states they have it, but in many states still they do not. And none of us should rest until every American, all 300 million of us that are then eligible to vote, have the opportunity to vote on a voter verifiable paper trail. As to impeachment, and as to holding, as the sign says, investigations which create accountability, which keep our government in check, let me say this. First of all, I imagine everyone has read or picked up a copy of this article from the Wall Street Journal, "The Party's Left Pushes for a Seat at the Table." And right in the second paragraph, it talks about this new phenomenon in the Democratic Party, which is that members of the Progressive Democrats of America, which is an activist group, the article says, an activist group working to keep the party true to liberal priorities. Well, that's true, but I would argue the Progressive Democrats of America are doing something more than simply keeping the Democratic Party true to liberal priorities. I think you're keeping the Democratic Party true to the Constitution of the United States. That's what this is. Now, I'm not Catholic, but this is my time for confession.
Well, you are in the proper setting, my friend.
Okay. All right. I'm new to this confession stuff, so help me along. But in the context of impeachment, I did not sign on. And before we go further, Keith and I think both of us share an enormous amount of respect for Dennis Kucinich.
Oh, yeah.
And
did the right thing.
The leadership that he has provided.
Yeah.
And it would not be proper to engage in any discussion without giving first due to Dennis. I kept going back to my district and holding town hall meetings. In my district, every district has its own unique qualities, but mine is made up, I would argue, of many of the most patriotic people in this country. I represent a district that has more people enrolled in Medicare than I think any other district in America. More World War II veterans and Korean War veterans than probably almost any congressional district. And I kept coming home, and in town hall meeting after town hall meeting, I kept hearing from people, regular, ordinary Americans, a whole bunch that had, like I said, fought in World War II in Korea. And people kept saying, "Wexler, what's with you Democrats? When will Democrats have a backbone? When will Democrats have a bold response to an administration that was abusing governmental power? And when will you begin to hold hearings to hold the administration accountable?" And for a short period of time, I bought into the argument that the Democratic leadership, as much as I respect them, I bought into the argument that, you know what, when the American people gave the Democrats a majority in 2006, that they were fed up with partisan bickering, they were fed up with no results, they wanted us to improve health care, they wanted us to get our troops out of Iraq responsibly, they wanted us to improve our educational system, they wanted us to do a whole host of things. And we were trying. And we were passing some very important bills, children's health, moving the minimum wage up. But the president kept vetoing almost every one of them. And I got to the point where I said, you know what? I got to start listening to my constituents. They're demanding accountability. And as well-intentioned as the Democratic plan was in January of 2007, to produce all these results for the American people, the president wasn't meeting us halfway. He wasn't meeting us any of the way. And in fact, we had a greater obligation to the Constitution than we do anything else. And I came to the realization that I could not live with my own personal small piece of a legacy in the context of the last 2 years, let alone the 8 years of the Bush administration, if I did not stand up and say that Congress has the responsibility to hold impeachment hearings, first for the vice president, and then the president if the evidence went there. And I don't want to monopolize the discussion. Let me just stop with this. Keith and I think, have been a team with some others on this. There is no doubt that there is credible evidence that this administration may have ordered the illegal use of torture in this country, and it ought to be investigated. There is no doubt that this administration may have fired U.S. attorneys for political, partisan purposes, and that politicizes the Justice Department in a way that there ought to be investigations. There's no doubt that this administration may have manipulated intelligence that brought us into war based on false pretenses in Iraq, and it ought to be officially investigated by the Congress of the United States. And there are several other issues. But I have become convinced that actually the single most important issue at this point in time in the context of the Constitution is the continual abuse of power by this administration with respect to executive privilege, and the failure of this administration to answer before the Congress of the United States like every other administration in history has done before.
Bob Wexler. Okay, you got one more.
I'm going to close with this 30 seconds. We may not accomplish impeachment in the next 5 weeks, but we ought to still push for the inherent power of contempt to get Karl Rove and those other members of the administration and former members to answer to the American people, and we ought to have the courage to do it. Thank you so much.
Let me ask you one more thing about it before we go. And then I'm going to put, but I want to keep. No, I'm going to keep. All right. You know, when you put Bob Wexler up there, boy, you better watch out, because it's not everybody who can get the crowd cheering from a chair, right? They usually. I want to ask Congressman one more thing, and I know your time. You've got you still got to go help Mr. Obama write his speech. So I understand that that's high duties here. The young woman there is holding up fire-breathing liberal, saying everybody's got to read that book. Congressman Wexler, I got a question for you on that Judiciary Committee. What happens if after November 4th, President Bush pardons Karl Rove and pardons everybody else who's been associated, or even just a pattern of pardons, which looks an awfully lot like he's trying to close a door there? Is there anything you can do at that point? And if not, do we need to talk about some sort of a constitutional amendment or way to address the abuse of the pardon power?
I think there's a couple of things. There are some practical things that the Congress could do if it chose to, not with total effectiveness, but with some degree of effectiveness, back the president into a corner before November to make a commitment not to do precisely.
Hold hearings on pardons?
We could hold hearings on pardons. We could pass some legislations relating to the use of the pardon power, but of course it is a constitutional power that the president has that we cannot abridge. But what I think is most relevant is the president's behavior post-election, I believe, will illustrate the degree to which criminal prosecution will be relevant and viable subsequent the president and the vice president leaving office. The last 2 months of his administration relative to how he deals with this issue, I think will in many ways present the either opportunity or case for criminal activity to occur after the administration leaves. And I think the president ought to be very careful in the manner in which he exercises the pardon power if he's doing so to cover up crimes that he, his vice president, or other high administration officials have in essence had a hand in.
Congressman Robert Wexler. Congressman, you don't actually have to go write Barack Obama's speech unless he gives you a call this afternoon, but you do have to go, I know. And we're going to thank Congressman Wexler for joining us today.
Thank you.
Been a terrific member of our panel. He is the person who came to us when we needed him to stand up and fight for restoring the Constitution of the United States. Robert Wexler. Robert Wexler. Congressman Ellison up here saying, "Go get him, Bob." Now, I'm going to sit down here because it's always challenging with this coming and going. But that's been the nature of our PDA events and why they've been I think, so effective. Do you know that we put something up yesterday from our conversations on the website? It's already had more than 60,000 hits. So people all over the country are tuning in and watching these conversations. This is a big deal, and call me crazy, I suspect a few people are going to be interested in what Congressman Wexler had to say. They should also be interested in Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison came to Congress in 2006, and 2006. It only took about 220 years to bring this measure of religious diversity to our Congress, first Muslim elected to Congress. But he came to Congress not as a Muslim, not as an African American, but as a constitutional scholar. I think that's fair to say. You're a lawyer. Advocate, he'd rather say. I want to start off with a question for you here, and we talked a little bit about impeachment, and he signed on very, very early to the Cheney impeachment and to these other measures. He was there. I want to talk about the politics of this year and the Constitution. For the first time in the history of the Democratic or Republican parties, both nominees, the nominee for president and the vice presidency of the Democratic Party, are professors of constitutional law. Barack Obama teaches at Northwestern, or has taught at Northwestern, constitutional law courses. Joe Biden teaches constitutional law at a university in Delaware. How are you going to keep them thinking about the Constitution if and when they come to power?
Well, if I may say, I think that one thing that progressives and Democrats in general have to do is get over their fear of impeachment. I mean, it's sort of like we think we're doing this extraordinarily, unusually, incredibly rare thing, when in fact, given that the president can pardon wrongdoing, criminal behavior, what can we do other than use impeachment to hold our role as a co-equal branch of government equal to that of the executive? I mean, skip Bush for a moment. We are in danger. In fact, we might even arguably be there already, where there is the big executive and the little legislative and judiciary. And unless we want to maintain the constitutional balance that the Constitution requires, we must get in the executive's chops whenever they are arguably committing high crimes and misdemeanors. And this president has done more than anyone. And I agree with Robert when Karl Rove tells us, hey, yeah, you gave me a subpoena, but I can't make it, so I'll get with you when I feel like it. He needs to get arrested, and he needs to get... I mean, this guy hasn't even come to committee and asserted a privilege. He just said, I'm busy. That kind of disrespect for the American people must not be tolerated. Now, you just said, we're clearing out the jail in the Capitol right now. But it's a small one, but big enough for Karl. Let me, I'm not joking either, by the way. Let me just say this. Yeah, Obama and Biden both are lawyers, both understand the Constitution, have taught the subject. But the fact is that it is inherent in the power of the executive to use as much power as others will let you use. It's really not about the president being necessarily an evil individual. It's about the constitutional framework and the balance that is required to make the system work as it was designed. So yeah, we got a bad actor now, but in the future, let me just be clear. Even a good president is gonna say, look, I have goals I wanna achieve. This constitutional stuff and getting it through Congress takes a long time, is slow, and I just wanna do it my way. And no, that's not the way the system works. So you know what? We are not going to rely on good faith. We're going to rely on the constitutional checks and balances, and that's the way we are going to keep our good and great President and Vice President Obama and Biden in line with the Constitution.
Follow-up question for the Congressman, and then we take to Victor. Congressman, you touched on something that I think is one of the essential struggles with upholding the Constitution. Everybody swears an oath to defend it, to make it central, much more central even than the physical safety of the Republic, is to stick to those basic concepts of the Constitution. And yet, have we not fallen into a dangerous zone where we make the Constitution partisan? That we say, if our guy's in, he's got a lot of flexibility. He does it his way. And a lot of folks say it's okay because we know he's a good guy. If their guy's in, we throw it at him. We try to use it against him. Is there any way that we can rise above that and get Congress? What are the steps for Congress to start reasserting, to start moving where you're talking about? Because if we don't, I fear that even a President Obama and a President Biden taking those powers that you discussed may have an awful lot of people cheering them on as they, a quick example, a friend of mine said, yeah, but what if John Edwards, now nobody likes him, but when they liked him, what if John Edwards becomes president and he uses his presidential authority to end poverty? Shouldn't we cheer him on?
Well, let me tell you, we should cheer him on to end poverty from the presidency as long as he does it constitutionally. You understand? So, but here's the thing, the constitutional power, the steps to make sure that we make certain that no matter who's in office, that we elevate the Constitution and use it as our bedrock of governance, is that people like you, John, and everybody here insist that members of Congress support and defend and uphold the Constitution. What that means is we need some folks who, even in unpopular times, will run the risk of popular disapproval to uphold the Constitution. In your book, Impeachment, you make the point that this is a genius idea, impeachment, because it is the safety valve to make sure that a runaway executive, whether they're doing something that some of us think is good or some of us think is bad, is there and makes the president mind the fact that he has an adherence and an obedience to the Constitution. In my view, I think that what we need to do is keep on writing books like yours, like Robert's, holding forums like this. Ultimately, our only salvation is an active and vigilant public who believes in their freedom. You know what I mean? The fact is that eternal vigilance is our freedom. There's no sleeping on the Constitution. Citizenship is an active and important and also time-consuming activity. And you cannot say, well, he's a good guy, so we trust him. No, don't trust anybody, right? Don't trust, I mean, really. No, don't do that. And just remember, the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights, I believe that it was passed in, if my memory is correct, 1789. I think, I know I was still in law school when we celebrated the bicentennial of the Constitution. And as you know, it's many years after the Declaration of Independence. Well, one of the constitutional debates, and I know scholars that have better knowledge than me can refine the point, is that in the original framework of the Constitution, that it was like, look, the specific rights of citizens and states are assumed. We're all good guys here. And then, no, some people said, you know what? No. We need some specific Bill of Rights, specified So, because we don't trust that the federal government over time is going to do the right thing. We need a specific right to petition the government, a specific right that there'll be no state religion that all of us have to adhere to, a specific right that the government cannot invade your privacy unless there is probable cause supported by a warrant achieved through a neutral magistrate, that you have a right to counsel, that you have a right to a trial. These are specific things that must be in place. And don't forget, one of our constitutional amendments, I think it's the 10th, perhaps the 9th, my memory's a little faulty this morning, says that all of the powers to the states except for those specifically enumerated in the Constitution, which preserves the proper balance between the state and federal government. This is how active, free people stay active and free, by adhering to the Constitution. And if I may, you indulge me one more moment, one of the things I discovered in the Constitution is in Article 6, which said that there is no religious test for holding a public office.
Unfortunately, there was a congressman from Virginia, a Republican congressman, who had not read past 5.
Well, John, if I may say so, if you're going to swear to uphold the Constitution, I think you ought to at least read it once. The whole thing.
Everybody knows the story, of course. The congressman from Virginia got all concerned that Congressman Ellison was going to swear his ceremonial oath on a copy of the Quran. And, you know, congressmen from Virginia happened to come from Charlottesville, which is where Monticello is. And he represented Thomas Jefferson's home. Oh, and this guy was ranting and raving. And then he kind of shut up after Keith Ellison checked Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Quran out of the Library of Congress and swore his oath on that. Victor Navasky was there in 1787. So he knows the original intent better than anyone. But he has stood up to Democratic and Republican presidents on constitutional issues, filed lawsuits, been all over, put the nation's good name up against and into many struggles. Victor, have you ever worried so much as you do now about our regard for the Constitution and its status in our country?
Thanks, John. First, I want to say, honored to be here and glad you're all here. But I do feel, after listening to Jesse Jackson and Congressman Wexler and Congressman Ellison, like the guy who comes on after Gypsy Rose Lee with the Trained Dog Act. And it's not my, métier. I read manuscripts and write, and so anyway. But thanks for the question. But here's what kept occurring to me as I listened to Jesse Jackson, and I agree with, I guess, everything everybody has said. But I think back and I say to myself, Robert Kennedy is one of my heroes. I wrote a book called Kennedy Justice, and compared to the Justice Department today, he was a great attorney general. He was a special attorney general regardless. Robert Kennedy signed off on the bugging of Martin Luther King and presided over an FBI which which encouraged Martin Luther King to commit suicide, threatening to expose documents that suggested he was engaged in sexual and immoral activities. This was under a Democratic administration. And after Bobby was killed and rightly celebrated, he ran a very special campaign against the Vietnam War. I found myself in New York, and I ended up in 1974 as the campaign manager for Ramsey Clark. Now, I have unlimited admiration for Ramsey. I was his campaign mismanager, I called myself, because he ran for the Senate and didn't get elected, although we started out with 1% of the vote at the Democratic Convention. He won the nomination, then ran against Jake Javits, who was the highest vote getter in the country. under Ramsey Clark at the Justice Department, he signed off on the indictment of Dr. Spock, of Marcus Raskin, and of a handful of others, invoking the anti-racketeering conspiracy laws to put these people in prison. Now, Ramsey later expressed regret for invoking the anti-racketeering laws and gave a very good explanation about why these people asked to be indicted. They wanted to test the Constitution, and that was his responsibility at that point. My point here is not to tarnish the reputations of Robert Kennedy and Ramsey Clark, who are genuine heroes in our political culture, each in very different ways. But to say something happens to people when they assume office, get in power, and it happens to Democrats, and it happens to good Democrats. And so I think the last observation of Representative Ellison, that it is critical that there be public, that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, is one of the most important things to take away from this convention, this historic convention, this great convention, which is going to give us maybe our first African-American president. So that's my introductory thought. It's not an upbeat thought, but I think it's a very important one. So thanks a lot.
Victor Navasky. So as long as we're not going upbeat, why don't you compare, you wrote Naming Names, a history of some of the darker stages of the McCarthy era. Is this time, how compare this time now as regards the feeling of the country, the respect for the Constitution, to the times you've written about in the past, or just generally to the past? How bad is it?
Well, go back to the period of Naming Names. I wrote about the Hollywood blacklist, but it was a period when, remember, it's known now as McCarthyism. And it was a period when, among other things, there was not just the McCarthy Committee, but the House Un-American Activities Committee, so-called Little House Un-American Activities Committees in many states of the Union. Every police department in a major metropolitan area had its own Red Squad. It was a period when there was something called the Subversive Activities Control Board. You had to register if you were on a list of organizations with the Subversive Activities Control Board. There was something called the Attorney General's List, which included the National Lawyers Guild, which challenged it and happened to win their suit. But it was a period when behind the scenes, of course, J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI were doing things under subsequently the COINTEL program, which were unthinkable during the McCarthy years. So those were terrible years where the main constitutional abuses that we were aware of were from the legislative branch. Then came the post-McCarthy years, and that's when the COINTEL program came, where the FBI, behind the scenes and out of sight, was doing things that were that the Constitution prohibited. It's not just that they were wiretapping in addition to bugging Martin Luther King. There's an organization called Political Research Associates, which in advance of this convention has released a set of documents about the activities of the Bureau, part of the executive branch, in Denver. One of them I've just been reading was a suggestion by an FBI agent that they send the Bureau of the United States government, send to the parents of Vietnam soldiers who had been killed in Vietnam materials relating to SDS and how they were trying to undermine the American way. Now, this was such a scurrilous recommendation that even J. Edgar Hoover had questions about it. But the point is that after, so you had the McCarthy period when you had these legislative abuses. You also had, by the way, then you had the COINTEL period where you had these executive abuses. And then, while this was going on, you had, during the Kennedy years also, they appointed some good judges, but basically, down south in the Fifth Circuit, in order to get judges appointed, you had to go through Harold Cox, you had to go through Senator Eastland, who was heading up the Judiciary Committee, and the way to get your appointments through was to appoint people who were okay with Senator Eastland. And so a lot of segregationist judges found their way onto the bench. And I'm going to jump a little and say, then came the Reagan years, and in the Reagan years, they were ushered in by the mandate for, I forget what it was called, but it was a mandate that the Heritage Foundation put out, and they gave an agenda for conservative change. And as a and they recommended putting informants and anti-nuclear groups and other places that used to be done illegally. They recommended making it legal. All of the things that were so unthinkable for the executive to do prior to the Reagan years were recommended to legitimize during the Reagan years. And meanwhile, starting with Reagan, but also in the Bush years, they started making appointments to the judiciary that would carry out their vision of the Constitution. So you go back to the McCarthy years and you have the legislative assault on the Constitution. You go to the FBI during the post-McCarthy years, the Reagan years, and you have the executive branch abuse of the Constitution, and then you come up and you get the judicial abuse of the Constitution by the appointment of judges who have no respect for a legitimate view of the Constitution. So when you ask me about today, is it worse? It is worse, I have to tell you. You know, that the idea that you can detain people and send them to Guantanamo and deny them habeas corpus, forget a right to a speedy trial, attempt to deny them the right to talk to a lawyer, have them taken in secret, have this process of rendition, send people to secret prisons. Those were unthinkable even under the disgraceful and unfortunate heritage of which this is a sort of, one hopes, culmination, and now we begin the rollback. So that's my brief answer to your good question.
Victor Navasky. See, I thought Victor was going to give us this kind of hopeful thing where he said, you know, so it's been really bad in the past and we beat them and so our job isn't so hard. Then he says it's worse now. So Keith Ellison, you know, now that we know it's like as bad as it can get, you're on the Judiciary Committee. How are you going to fix this thing come the exit of George Bush et al.? What are you going to do? And I know, you know I like impeachment, but what are we going to do with this core constitutional renewal project that begins in January, if not sooner?
Well, that's a great question, John, but as you know much better than I do, there is no what are you going to do, Congressman? Yeah. There is what are we going to do, right? There's what are we going to do? You know this. I mean, I know that that's a way of speaking, but the reality is, you know, that democracy is a team effort, and successful democracy has many hands to the plow, right? And one of the most effective, and perhaps the most effective, is to create the national consensus around respect for the Constitution, no matter whose ox may get gored at this moment or that moment. So this is essential that we're having this meeting today, that it will be online, that all of us go out there and we write and we talk and we do a blog and all this stuff that we do to make room for the Constitution. I believe personally that elections, particularly us Democrats in more recent years, have organized, and sometimes we think of an election as a finish line. In reality, the election is just a marker on the long journey. Because, you know, more democracy really happens more between elections than at elections. And that democracy I'm talking about is you call in my office, right in my office, and people who do the job I do to say, get on your job, do your job, don't fail, don't shrink. We are in favor of democracy, and we're going to support you and expect you to fight for it. Okay, so that's sort of a little bit of context. So what do? First thing we do, we pass the contempt through Congress before October 1st to get Rove arrested for contempt of Congress. We got to do that. First thing we do. So we get out of here, and I'm down for the cause. I'm all for it. I want to be leading the band on this. But there are 435 members of Congress, and John Conyers is there, Robert's there, there's others who are there. Tammy Baldwin is there, Hank Johnson's there, Steve Cohen is there. There are folks that what? Who? Okay, now somebody's screaming out names. Now let me just say this.
You don't have to name the whole committee.
We don't have to name the whole committee. If your member is on it, thumbs up. If your member is not, are you sitting in on their office? Are you writing emails to their office? Are you writing letters to their office? I mean, I'm saying this is the real issue. Am I wrong about this, please? I mean, the fact is that, it really is a team effort. I promise to do my part, and I know you're going to do your part, but everybody's got to do what they do best, whether that's write, whether that's talk on the radio, whether that's organize, or what it is. And let me just tell you this, some good old sit-ins would not hurt, there's nothing wrong with that, and say, look, we've got to get it, but not just only sit-ins, start out with a request and then elevate the level of your urgency of your request. What do we do next? I think what we do next is we can also continue to push for impeachment. I want you to know, I want you to know that when I was a state legislator in Minnesota. Minnesota, I love Minnesota, thank you, sorry for that. My point is that I introduced a resolution with the signature of others who are in the Progressive Caucus, using a little known state device to try to prompt impeachment. And it was most valuable as a discussion starter. We talked about it a lot because I introduced this thing with the help of others. And so we've got to continue to push this impeachment thing. Will we get an impeachment? I don't know. Should we try? Absolutely, we should not give it up. We shouldn't. Let me tell you this, without the urgent, consistent, persistent push for impeachment, we wouldn't have got those executive abusive hearings that we got we had in the last week in July. Wouldn't have happened without you, and so don't quit now, keep it up. God bless you or whoever you pray to for the efforts that you made.